Hello and welcome to an all-important It's the Economy. Of all the data released by the government, the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey is by far the most important. It tells you exactly what a typical Indian family consumes. And depending on the changes in that consumption basket, in what the Indian household consumes, the NSO constructs the CPI index and even the components of the GDP. Now, the latest All India Household Consumption Expenditure Survey covering 2.6 lakh households comes after an 11-year gap. And what it shows us is that on the face of it, the pace of consumption growth has slowed a little from 2011 to 2022-23 compared to the previous 8 years, that is from 2004-5 to 2011-12. But what are the other key takeaways? Let's ask two economists, Sakshi Gupta, the Vice President and Senior Economist at HDFC Bank, and Madhavi Arora, Lead Economist at Emkay Global. Ladies, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, first up, Sakshi, what is the most important takeaway? Would you say that you have to admit consumption is a little slower in its growth?
Good morning, Latha. Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest takeaway from this data is that while, at the aggregate level, you see that, the gap between the rural and urban consumption is, kind of closing and has been reducing over the last 11 years. But I think a large part of this reduction that we are seeing in this data is coming from the rural affluent, right? A lot of the rural catch up has actually happened at the top 20-30% of the income pyramid. And in fact, if you look at the bottom 20%, there the gap between the rural and the urban consumption expenditure has in fact increased. Right. So I think one of the biggest takeaways I have from this data is that there's a lot of unevenness even within consumption between the rural and the urban sector.
Oh, okay. There is still a gap. Madhavi, same question to you. For you, the most important takeaway?
I think I agree with Sakshi. One of the most important thing, of course, was the fact that the gap between the average urban and rural consumption, as a proportion of overall consumption of rural sectors actually dramatically reduced. But, one thing that most people are talking about is essentially that, how the rural poverty has actually, or the rural segment of the economy is improving at the margin. So there are a lot of mixed trends that we are seeing. As she rightly mentioned, if you look at the time series data, what we see is that the rural-urban divide has actually widened at the bottom of the pyramid, but has actually closed at the top end of the pyramid. But the good part, if I look at the this particular year's template, what we see is that the urban inequality and rural inequality actually has reduced. So within rural-urban segment, what we observe is that the consumption spending inequality between the bottommost 5% and the topmost 5% of the respective population of rural and urban has reduced at the margin, of course. But again, you are, growing economy, and, you're likely to see very non-linear pattern in these things in which way.
Absolutely. Yeah, as you grow, the inequality will increase. And more importantly, why you don't perhaps see the inequality increase so much is how much more will you consume? Whether it is food or consumer durables, from the poorest to the richest, okay, it's 10 times more for the richest family compared to the poorest. But beyond that, the richer family will save. There is perhaps a limit to consumption, and perhaps there is no category called foreign travel, which will perhaps take some of the consumption. But Sakshi, let's get to the brass tacks in terms of how it will impact the most important index, CPI. Food is occupying less and less of a family's income, of a family's consumption?
Oh, absolutely. I think this data clearly has implications for how we calculate inflation. And I think subsequently, over the next 1.5 years, we should get a revised, CPI number as well. But, as is, typical of an economy where income starts increasing, a household would tend to spend less on essentials and food and start diversifying towards non-food items, right? What is interesting in this data is that you will see that the top three commodities in the non-food space that the urban household is spending on is essentially conveyance, it's rent, and consumer durables, right? But if you do a similar mapping on the rural side, I find it very interesting that a rural household actually spends a lot on medical expenses. So that's one of the top three categories where the rural household is spending on, right? So there's a lot of divergence between what the rural household and the urban households are spending on. I think from the bottom line is that when we are looking at inflation and when we are looking at a policy response going forward, given the fact that food is becoming less and less important, or at least the volatile part of the food basket, which is vegetables, cereals, etc., they are becoming less important. I think there has to be a greater sensitivity response towards the non-food side of the consumption basket, right, which is essentially core inflation. So I think going forward, there has to be a shift towards looking more at core inflation, perhaps, because that is, more than 60% of what households are spending on.
Okay. Yeah, actually, let's run the cereals household consumption series as well. We were running the food time series as you were speaking, Sakshi. If you look at cereals, it has fallen to 3.9%, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the proportion of the household basket. It is not 39. That's a typo. It is 3.9% that it has fallen to compared to what it was, 12% or thereabouts. So, Sakshi, you think now you will have fewer and fewer politicians giving free grain? It is in any case not a very big component. On a more serious note, will it not change the CPI basket? And therefore, in actuality at the moment, perhaps CPI is lower than what we are seeing it to be.
Absolutely. I mean, if I were to do analysis of what CPI would look like over the last 6 months, given these new weights, I would get a lower number for inflation, because we know that a lot of the shocks or upward pressures have come from the food side, right? Vegetables, cereals, pulses, those have been the bigger pain point. So I would get, a lower inflation number. But I think there's another aspect that we also need to, kind of think about, that there have been a number of government measures wherein a lot of the essentials, be it cereals, the free food grain program, you look at some part of the fuel and electricity, basket. A lot of this has also been kind of supported by, government measures, right? And therefore, a household finds itself spending or having more, discretionary spending available to spend on other items, right? So,
actually, Sakshi, let me just get Madhavi in on this. Madhavi, you think now when will the reconstructed CPI come? And is it likely to be distinctly lower, like, by 30, 40 basis points?
Correct. So, this is basically a summary fact sheet of the latest survey. So, we will have another survey, which is already underway. So, I think it will be completed by July 2024 is what was written in documents. So, accounting for the time period, with regard to compiling results and, in terms of working on change of index, I think the next series, which will be updated, most likely will be released not before July or August 2025. So, we still have a long way to go. And if I really play that, the change in the composition of food versus non-food, I think clearly with the new weights of food and beverages, which we're trying to impute back into the series, the weight could actually fall from 46% to almost 40 to 41% in the new CPI series with regard to food. But one more thing that one has to keep in mind is that even though the share of overall food would probably be lower in the new index, uh, the share of fruits and veggies are actually still going to be relatively marginally lower, not materially lower, which also means that broadly there's going to be no escaping from the occasional heat of potato, tomatoes, and onions that you have seen in the past. More importantly, you would see a relatively lower impact of or mixed impact of imported inflation because while the share of edible oils probably has come off, you're also seeing an increased share of conveyance both in urban and rural, which is basically linked to fuel and food prices. So again, the policy response would be important in terms of how the transmission of imported inflation takes place. And third and most importantly is with regard to the non-cereal item, which is basically the protein-led basket, which is increasing its share in the composition of food itself, would also imply that not only India is one a protein deficient economy, it also is a protein supply deficient economy. So the policy response for food supply management has to also diversify from core cereals to probably pulses and other milk and other packaged goods and stuff. So I think the policy supply management chain also has to evolve in line with the evolution of consumption behavior of households.
No, fair point. That the fact that pulses have gone down rather sharply, but milk has remained fairly good, and so has vegetables. So there will be more volatility. But clearly, cereals going down in the CPI basket would take away about 30-40 basis points. Madhavi, the other, Sakshi, the other thing that hurt me a lot is that the share of education has gone down. This is not very good when we are about to encash our demographic dividend, would you say?
Absolutely, Latha, I agree with you that the share of expenditure on education, both in the rural and urban areas, coming down is a bit puzzling. It is difficult to say whether this is because of greater, access in terms of government schools, free education, or whether this is, kind of showing you a more worrisome trend on the education side. So it's very difficult to basically dissect the two. But, for me as well, it was very surprising that the education segment it has such a, low weight, both on the urban as well as the rural side.
Yeah, we cannot be sure whether it is because people are spending less or they are getting more value for money. We don't know. Madhavi, just a final question to you. The conveyance amount being so much higher, does that mean that, we have to shift from food subsidies to fuel subsidies? Clearly, either people are traveling more and that's why the weight is more, or they're spending more on travel. What would you take away from that? As well, consumer durables doing so well. Is that a sign of good prosperity?
So I think on consumer durables, I'd like to add one bit that the rural segment, if I see the growth, the CAGR of rural spending versus urban spending, there has been a much better behavior of rural in terms of shift towards durable versus the urban one. So that again sort of shows and especially at the top end of the rural segment. So that sort of shows convergence of rural and urban affluent to some extent. But that said, coming to the first point of yours where you talked about how we need to probably move our subsidy policy, which I also agree with. As I said that there's been sort of a higher share of conveyance, which again is linked to fuel and crude prices. So fiscal policy remains a big stopgap in terms of how the transmission really takes place into inflation if the government does not move its way towards increasing subsidy in this line.
Okay, fair enough. We're out of time, but you'll have given us a lot of rich takeaways. One being that food is going to occupy a lesser space, and therefore perhaps the current inflation, which is largely food supported, is likely to have been lower if the index had already been revised, if we had had that 2017 survey, which was scrapped. The other important takeaway, education falling down. We have to find out why the share of education is lower. And conveyance going up. Is it because Indians are traveling more and that's why there is a bigger mobility bill? Or is it that they're traveling on private transport and the government has invested less on public transport? Is that the worry? But the important point is the household survey is such a rich survey that it is going to lead to policy changes and data changes